Okay, welcome. Give me a thumbs up if you can hear me. Just make sure that's working. Sometimes people have let me talk for a very long time before they let me know that I wasn't audible. Okay, well, welcome back from hopefully a great Christmas holiday break. My family and I just got back from spending a few weeks in Colorado skiing, and no one was hurt, so that was good. Anyway, spinning back up the Agile Lunch and Learns, what we're planning on doing today is I've been kind of taking notes over the past, probably 5 years now of examples and stuff, experiences I had in working with teams and how it mapped to different Agile principles, both when teams are following the Agile principles really well, and also when maybe they're ignoring the Agile principles or doing something kind of the opposite of that. So my goal for today, and we'll see if we get through everything, is to go through each of the principles and talk about a positive and negative example of each one. So that's our plan. At the end, I'll highlight some of the things we've got coming up. So anyway, let's get started. Okay, so first principle. Our highest priority is to satisfy the customer through early and continuous delivery of valuable software. And an example I had of this that I thought was helpful, particularly because most of you guys may have probably have encountered this, is when we were building out the Agile Lunch and Learn site. So the events.xeric.net, it's the thing that manages sending you emails and stuff. When we started with that, it was just a spreadsheet, and then it evolved into a database and some scripts, and then a little bit of automation on top of that with a Google, it was a Google group, and then eventually grew into the site that we have today. But what I thought was most interesting about that is we were focused on satisfying the customer, who happened to be, right? Satisfying myself as a customer through early and continuous delivery of valuable software. We started out with something very, very simple, but that was capable of keeping track of people that might want to come to the lunch and learn and take people off that were no longer interested. That focus on the continual and the valuable and continual delivery of valuable software grew into something that's much, much more complex now, but that's not how it started. It was a focus that took us step by step of learning what worked, learning what didn't. And there's all kinds of things we learned along the way, dealing with how you actually send calendar invites out that work correctly and have the right time zone, and hundreds of things that could go wrong. But by doing it step by step, we were able to focus on how do we get value from this, including starting with just very, very simple stuff that we were able to do with Excel and some shell scripts and a database, and then grew into this, which is running on ERP Next now, today. So anyway, that's how that kind of grew. Now, the flip side of it, a negative example of highest priority being to satisfy the customer through early and continuous delivery of valuable software is, and this is something I've seen on several projects, but there was some individuals I worked with at the government, and they were working on another project and had been working on it for some time, and it finally got canceled. And so I followed up with them and said, what are the takeaways? What do I need to learn from this? What were the takeaways you had from this that might be useful? And they said that when they were building the software, they got to the point that they had 80% of everything done, but not 100% of anything. Nothing was completely done where they could actually use it. And what happened was that since they weren't prioritized, since the way everything was structured, lots of stuff going on, and that makes this hard, and particularly government is a hard place to work on delivering software. But they were never at that point of saying, okay, here's something that does something that we can deliver to the customer. Here's another piece that actually does something and delivers it to the customer. So just give me a thumbs up if you've ever been in this category up here of getting a bunch of things almost done, but nothing that's actually usable. Has anyone ever experienced that? Okay, so that's probably a very common experience. I know I've experienced that. I've written code like this before, like, oh, I've got this piece and it's going to do all these things. I've got this piece that's going to do all these things, but nothing's actually where it's usable. And that's where this principle of trying to figure out how can we satisfy the customer through early and continuous delivery of valuable software should drive us to trying to get 100% of something that provides value, and then 100% of something else that provides value, and evolving from there. Next principle. Welcome changing requirements, even late in development. Agile processes harness change for the customer's competitive advantage. Agile processes harness change for the customer's competitive advantage. So the example I think of with this was a company I was working with that does stuff with, they did a bunch of stuff with cattle genetics. So, you get the egg from this cow and the sperm from this bull, and you put them under a microscope and make sure they're fertilized, make sure they're starting to grow, and then you find another cow that you put it into that you know is going to be a really, really good mom. Very interesting stuff. Lots of statistics and stuff around this. And we were creating the system for them that is basically kind of like the ERP system for keeping tracks of eggs and sperms and embryos as they go through their process. Well, they called us up one day, and their question was, how fast can we make our system handle goats? Being in a rural area, this doesn't sound like quite as crazy of an ask, but that's what they want to know. How can, because what had happened is they were working mainly with cattle because that's where they saw their market being, but somebody found out about what they were doing, and it turns out there are a lot of very dedicated goat breeders that needed the services. And so we were able to take that and very quickly turn it around, quickly satisfy the customer, giving them a competitive advantage in this market that they hadn't even been aware of as something that they were going to pursue to start with. So that's an example of welcome changing requirements. And one thing I want to point out is if you're developing software in a way that recognizes change, that's going to welcome changing requirements, you have to build your software in a different way to take advantage of changing requirements. If you build your software in a way that is very, very hard to change or very much assumes that nothing is going to change, it's very, very difficult to do this. Some of the ways that I've seen teams build software that assumes nothing is ever going to change is not writing any tests. So that's one big thing. If you don't think you're ever going to change it, it's hard sometimes to justify writing tests around it because like, well, it works and we're never going to touch this again. The other thing I've seen happen is when like premature scaling or premature optimizing for what you think you're going to need before you actually prove that you have a scaling problem. If you invest lots of time in building out so this can handle huge workloads that you're not sure that you're ever going to have, you will probably end up optimizing in ways that aren't going to help you for one, and more than likely are actually going to make it harder to make changes to the system as you move forward. An example of that might be a team that's working on trying to create extremely granular microservices. That can be very, very powerful. And there are companies that are using it to great effect to really, really be able to scale. But until you know that's actually your problem, having thousands of microservices you're trying to manage probably is not going to make it easier for you to change stuff if there's something in the market that you can respond to competitively. Let me mute everybody here just for a second. There we go. Okay. So a negative example of welcoming changing requirements. There was a system I was working on, and they were going to, I keep using the term ERP, but I guess that's what a lot of these things are. It was a very large system that was going to replace many existing systems. And that was what they were starting out with. So lots of effort into planning and building out this huge, a plan for this huge system. Well, as they got into it, the customer finally said, you know what, this all looks good and we may want this someday, but right now we just need you to replace this one system, this one piece over here. That's really valuable. If we can get that first and get that running, that's really, really valuable to us because of how systems are being retired and stuff like that. This particular project, though, had invested so much in assuming that the customer wasn't going to change anything, that was really, really difficult to do. Not just from a standpoint of how they had planned things, not just from a standpoint of how they had built things so far and architected things so far, but just the mentality of the idea that the customer wants something different was really, really hard to try to successfully shift. Because it had been assumed that the customer wasn't going to have these dramatically changing requirements, and so when that actually happened, it was a very difficult thing for them to do. Principle number 3, deliver working software frequently from a couple of weeks to a couple of months with a preference for the shorter time scale. It's a positive example of this project I worked on, and they took, as they were planning out, it was to replace an existing government system, and one of the things as they were talking through how they wanted to do it, what they wanted their delivery pipeline to look like in the end, they came to the conclusion that instead of building out, they had like a dev environment that was in the cloud, and then there was going to be kind of a testing environment in on-prem, and then finally production on-prem. They came to the conclusion that instead of building it out in that order, they should start by, they had the cloud environment already, but the next thing they wanted to build was the production environment, not the testing environment. Which sounded kind of crazy at first, but their logic was, if they could get to where they were practicing, even though the production environment wasn't going to be live, if they could get to where they were practicing taking changes all the way through with all the change management and everything else that had to go into production, because this was there were lots of requirements and governance around this, but their idea was if they could start doing that, that would prepare them for delivering working software frequently all the way through to where it could be working on real data. That turned out being very, very valuable to them, and then they backed into having the other systems. But they were approaching it from the very beginning with the idea of how do we deliver stuff frequently, all the way through, preferring the shorter time scale. They got, last time I checked with them, they had been running for about half a decade, I guess 7 years now, and they were deploying on average every week. The time to go through all their process without doing like a special emergency change was taking about 2 hours. But the only reason they got that way is they started with this principle of we want to be able to deploy working software frequently, and we're going to build our stuff, even the order we build stuff, in order to try to follow that principle. Flip side of things, another project I was working on was very focused on building a runway. And one thing I want to point out here is a lot of this stuff, a lot of these principles work together and help guide each other. So some of this, of creating a runway, could be seen as trying to have technical excellence and other things that Agile principles say. In this particular case, the runway was so big that they were deferring getting to the point that they were able to deliver working software frequently, to the point that it was spending like a year just doing the planning of getting stuff in place and then trying to deliver the software on it. The problem that they ran into, though, is since they were taking that type of approach of get everything in place and then start developing software, they ended up not being able to leverage the evolution as they discovered things. So they were making long-term commitments without necessarily getting the benefits of the feedback. So they were committing to things and then having to make the code work in ways that they had assumed, rather than letting the pipeline and all the stuff they're doing as runway evolve in response to actual code they were trying to do. So huge investment in building things like the pipeline. And then when it turned out that pipeline didn't fully support what they needed, it was really, really hard to change at that point, which goes back to the principle of being able to expect change. So those two things of trying to say expect change and work on delivering things frequently give you really, really good feedback. It can put you in a position to be much more successful. Principle number 4, business people and developers must work together daily throughout the project. So two examples here. These were two government projects I worked on that actually started out the same. Both of them started out with a business really embedded with the dev teams. So on one of them, they started out working with the customer. It worked really, really well. And what was amazing, actually, for both of them, they started out and was working really, really well with the customer embedded in the dev teams. And the way that it really showed up is when you're getting into discussions and developers saying, hey, I can do it like this, or I can do it like this. If there is a customer right there that's working with you on a daily basis, it's a lot easier to really get to help to really refine and understand what piece of this provides value to the customer. Because that's not always apparent unless you actually have the discussion. And it's really easy to have a story you're working on that's, big, and then discovering that the piece that the customer really sees as being valuable is the piece that's really, really simple. And the piece that the customer doesn't see as being valuable is the thing that's going to take 90% of the time. And by working daily with the customer, with business and developers working together daily, you can have those conversations and become much more efficient in how you're actually delivering your software, because it's really guided by the customer by the customer and the business in those daily interactions. So one team did this, and even a decade into the project, that's still how they were working. It had been live for, I guess it'd be more than a decade now. I'm feeling old. But the customers were still there. The business was still there, embedded with the developers, working usually in the same room every single day. The other project that started like that got some benefit from it, but then they got to the point where it's like, well, the customer and business needs to work on these things over here. And the customer was removed. And it was amazing to see. It wasn't that they weren't available at all, but they weren't necessarily working hands-on every day like they were before. And that really slowed down progress. You'd think, okay, the developers know exactly what to do, But that communication and that feedback turns out to be very, very valuable in the ability to go ahead and deliver on a regular basis and being able to really get to the heart of what is needed for the application and what can be left out. In this case, the customer often, when they were present, was making a lot of things and saying, oh yeah, leave that out. That's not really important. We can defer that till later. When the customer wasn't there, a lot more stuff started getting put in just because the developers assumed they asked for it. They must really want this. And those nuances were missed that can make the software a lot more efficient in being created. Okay, principle number 5. Build projects around motivated individuals. Give them the environment and support they need, and then trust them to get the job done. So one team I worked with, and this was also for a government project, and one of the things they started with is how can we make sure we support the team? And they asked the team, what type of computer do you want? So the team looked at some different things and came back and said, you know what, Macs are the closest to matching our environment that we're going to be working with in the cloud and in production. So we think that would be better. And this was an environment where Macs were not a common thing to be used, but management supported them in that and actually found a way to get them Macs. And what's interesting about it is the Macs were superior to what they would have been trying to do with Windows. There were lots of hoops they would have had to jump through with Windows that they didn't have to do with Mac. But the value of it wasn't just, there was a lot of value in having the computer that they wanted, but the real value was the team felt like management cared enough to try to make the project successful. And I'm not saying that you have to give developers, if they want this type of computer, you've got to get them a pink computer with red tennis shoes or whatever. But this was just an example of management really following through and saying, we're going to go ahead and build the project around motivated individuals and make sure to the best of our ability we give them the environment and support they need and then trust them to get the job done. That worked out very, very well for that team. And it wasn't just because they got the tools they wanted, it's because it built that trust between management and the devs to where that they were both working to make each other successful. I've been on other projects, and this, you've probably seen this too, but to where the attitude is kind of developers or the team is asking for something and can't seem to get something that seems fairly simple, that would make their jobs a lot easier, and you end up with kind of the attitude of, if leadership doesn't care, I don't care either. And that's where this principle really comes to play, right? If we've got people, and my goal in saying this is not that you need to just do, not that anything that a developer can possibly imagine or anybody on the team can possibly imagine has to be bought and given to them right away. But the point is, if you're in a situation though where people feel like they're not actually being enabled, it's not important enough to maybe, if you could spend $200 that will save them weeks and weeks of worth, if those types of things aren't at least being discussed or trying to find ways to give them the tools they need, it's really easy to get to this type of attitude. And this is not an irrational attitude to have if you're really having trouble getting the stuff you need to get your job done. Okay, principle number 6. The most efficient and effective method of conveying information to and within the development team is face-to-face conversation. So this is one I happen to really like, because having been on teams that were where people didn't talk face-to-face and been on teams that people did talk face-to-face, it's much more invigorating to be on teams where people are talking face-to-face. A couple teams I've worked with really took this to heart, and when they were remote, they were working with a virtual team room. One team I'm thinking of, they met together when they were first starting. For the first few years, they met together once a month, but then had virtual team rooms the rest of the time. And by virtual team room, I mean it's a video conference room that you use just like you would go into a regular team room. So you're up where you can see each other. This team had everybody on a separate monitor, so it wasn't like they were behind what they were trying to work on. And you could look over and say, hey, Bob looks like he's busy, heads down, or talking to somebody else right now. I'll wait and ask him about this in a few minutes. So it's one way I've seen people really focus on face-to-face communication. Here is, these are some shirts. I've put these on one team I was working with. It was my apparel-based coaching. We gave everybody these very comfortable sweatshirts that said, we value face-to-face communication. Turn your video on. Sent those out to everyone. I had some interesting stories come back from that. One of the people I was working with, his daughter took the sweatshirt because, like I said, very, very comfortable sweatshirt. I took the sweatshirt and was wearing it in her classes during COVID. She was in high school. And she would turn her video on. And she got this note from one of her teachers that he shared with me that I thought was great. He said, "Thank you so much for dedication, courage, and commitment to learning. I know I joke about it, but your simple act of turning on your camera really does make teaching virtually so much easier." From Mr. Griffith. Anyway, I thought that was very, very interesting to see how much just being able to see the people you're talking to was something that the teachers were saying this was really, really valuable to them, of just being able to teach instead of the black boxes, but to real live people. On the other hand, thinking of this principle, I was working with one team, and these were great people. I love them all very dearly. But one of the times I can't remember if I was out of the room, but audio was still on, or what was going on. But anyway, they all made a pact with each other and swore that they would not use their video when they were working from home. It came up with that on their own for some reason, because they were very, very much against it. Now, that team actually turned out to deliver stuff, and they were successful in delivering what they were delivering, right? The fact they didn't do this didn't completely wreck everything. But as they brought new people onto the team, there was a lot. It was harder to build that relationship than if they had to maybe embrace that just a little bit more. And what happens, what I see a lot of times is when I see teams trying to say we're not going to use face-to-face communication, you end up with people more likely to get stuck on problems where if I was sitting right across from you at a table and I couldn't figure out how to, what's the shortcut key for this, or I can't figure out how to solve this problem, I'm probably going to ask you if I think you happen to know, and we'll probably work through it a lot faster. Face-to-face communication helps enable those things. If we take that away, you end up with times where it just takes longer to work through stuff that you might not have had, longer to work through stuff that you could have solved with less friction. Another negative example I had here of not virtual is I was working with one team, and they would, it was really, really weird. So first week I show up and I'm in the team room for the daily stand-up. And we call into a conference bridge because we had some people spread around the country, and most of the people that I knew were supposed to be there weren't in the room. And then I realized they were on the call. I was like, okay, well, maybe they're taking the day off and just decided to call in, or they're not coming in today. So we go through the daily stand-up, work through everything, and then as soon as we finish the call, like 4 or 5 people walk in the door putting their phones into the pocket. They were just standing out in the hallway having the face-to-face meeting, and then just walking in. So it was, they were avoiding the face-to-face in the stand-up meeting, which is one of the main things you should be getting out of it, by standing out of the hallway on the telephone, which was kind of a weird thing to me. I didn't quite get all of it, and some of it was I didn't think they weren't really getting. We were trying to restructure the daily face-to-face meeting to make it more valuable to people, and I think that helped get them more involved. But it was just interesting to see them doing the exact opposite of what the Agile principles suggest you do. It wasn't. I mean, really, it was literally like 5 feet. They could have come in, and they would have been in where we could all see each other. Curious if anyone has ever seen something quite like that. Okay, principle number 7. Working software is the primary measure of progress. So this is one of the principles that I think is very, very key, and probably one of the ones, like I said, I mentioned the team that was like turning off their video. They were able to deliver great. This one, I have not seen anyone be able to deliver software if they're ignoring this. This one seems to be one of the key principles that if you ignore this one, you have very, very low chance of succeeding. So if we think of working software that's doing work. When I gave the example of the team that was getting to production first, part of their logic of doing that is in production, they were allowed to run real files through the system, even if it wasn't the system of record. By doing that, they were able to do real things with the software. So they were able to prove it was working by working on real stuff. And that turned out to be very, very valuable for them because they were able to discover stuff that would have taken them a lot longer otherwise. One team I was working with, the way they grouped their stories, and this generally is a reasonable way to do it, but let me give the definitions just in case you call things a little bit differently. Their stories were things, if they had a story on the board, that was something that represented something that the user could do something with. So something you could give to a user, and the user would go in and say, okay, now I can do this in the software. I wasn't able to do this before. So something that's written from the user standpoint and means something to the user. They also had tickets. And the tickets were things that maybe needed to be done, but weren't necessarily from the user's standpoint. So if they needed to like stand up in the pipeline a new security scanning tool or something like that, that wasn't really something that the user would see as a difference in the way they experience their software, so that would be a ticket. There's often a some pressure to push toward trying to break up your stories. Instead of slicing your stories more thinly, break up your stories into a series of tickets, like a ticket of set up the database. Well, if you haven't built anything on top of it, the user can't see that. So that would be a ticket. What we were trying to push for is getting more of those things that build just what you need in order to deliver this. Anyway, I had one team that was really, really latching on to that and getting the idea that they tried to avoid tickets as much as possible, because if there was something that needed done in a ticket, they wanted to find the story that it was supporting and build just what was needed for that particular story. I came in one day and I was told, we completed a ticket, and we felt horrible about it. They're like, we just felt dirty because we did this ticket. And it was some refactoring work or something like that needed to be done. But in the past, they had always done this as being part of a story. Just the next story, if you need to clean something up, you do it as part of that. But what I thought was interesting about this is they had seen the value so much of focusing on delivering stories and having all the work built around the way that they're delivering some more functionality to the user, that when something came up that they were like, well, we probably need to represent this on the board, they did it, and they're like, they just felt really, really, really bad about it. Which was great, right? Because it kind of showed that they had that right balance. Like, okay, maybe there was a reason to do this particular thing in that way, but it was something that felt uncomfortable, which was great, because it meant that most of the time they were focused on how do we deliver the next piece of functionality that we can show the user, that the user can use and actually touch and feel, and we can demonstrate, and they'll understand how we move things forward with working software. Other groups I've worked with, kind of very opposite approach, and the focus is so much on trying to build the foundation that everything becomes a ticket, or everything becomes something that's not actually a story, with the idea we're going to build all these things and then we'll pull it all together in the end. So we're going to spend 2 weeks building out the database, and then we're going to do 2 weeks building out the business stuff, and then 2 weeks building out the UI stuff, and then maybe another week trying to make sure it all works together, and then somewhere down the line we'll actually show it to the user, instead of building a slice all the way through. What happens if you do that is the primary concern becomes trying to make sure that you don't have to rewrite anything, or you don't have to change anything. If you're trying to work with stories and stay in a working state, you're going to have to evolve the software as you go. The waterfall mindset is more of, don't do that. Let's go ahead and build everything and just build it once. And we don't want to tear out some bricks and put other stuff in. This usually makes it very hard to focus on working software. And most of the teams I see doing this end up building huge foundations only to discover that foundation wasn't fit for purpose. So this is where like I said, this is probably one of the most important principles that I see, that if you violate, it makes it very, very hard to be successful with your team. So working software is the primary measure of progress, with the idea that working software is stuff that you can show to the customer and they say, hey, yes, this does something for me that I couldn't do before. It's not to say that there's never a time where you're like, well, we've got to deliver the API separately from this other thing that's going to use it. But wherever possible, trying to make sure that it's something in the way that the user thinks about it is going to lower your risk. Ticket to right, yes. Agile processes promote sustainable development. The sponsors, developers, and users should be able to maintain a constant pace indefinitely. Sponsors, developers, and users should be able to maintain a constant pace indefinitely. When you have a team, one of my big takeaways from principle number 8 is that when you have a team that's actually delivering working software, you end up with an energy that makes it a lot easier to deliver things in a sustainable way, because there's energy there, people are getting stuff done. Success creates an energy that helps you follow this principle. There is nothing more draining than spending week after week doing stuff that you know is not valuable to the customer. and that you're not getting feedback of how this makes their life easier. You're not getting feedback of, hey, this is good working code that we can actually use. Thank you for doing this. Here's the things that we need to change and how we need to evolve. On the other side of things, I've seen teams where the idea of sustainable pace just isn't really there. One team where they were trying to encourage the developers to work harder. You know, like we need you to work harder to do this because we've got this deadline coming up. But from the team's perspective, management wasn't necessarily managing things in a way that were actually helping refine down to the most valuable parts of what the customer needed. So the team was feeling that they weren't on a path to success anyway from the way the project was being managed, and kind of felt like if we aren't going to manage the project so it can succeed, I don't want to put any extra time into something that's just going to fail, regardless of if I work extra hard, show up early, stay late, and things like that. So when we think about sustainable development, I think the way that this usually ends up playing out, I mean, there's also the idea of don't expect people to work 80-hour weeks all the time. But I think it also the idea is make sure you're managing stuff so people can feel like they're making success. If you do that, this becomes a whole lot easier to have sustainable development because you have more energy when you feel like you're actually accomplishing something. Number 9, continuous attention to technical excellence and good design enhances agility. So this one is really interesting because I see teams oftentimes use this to justify working in a waterfall way. Because they read this and say technical excellence and good design enhances agility, and they miss the very first part of it. Continuous attention. Continuous attention means that we are going to continue to evolve. That's a very different thing than saying we're going to make all of our decisions up front to make sure they're technically excellent, and then we're going to make sure we've got really good design up front to enhance agility, and then we're going to start building. Example of this from one team is their very first story, they were going through and they were trying to build it, like I said, that slice all the way through of how can we get something that we can show to the user that does something the user can experience. On the back end, they were working with AWS Lambdas, and they knew that they probably wanted to use Java someday on the back end. However, JavaScript was something that they had enough experience with and was easy to deploy that they could do that really fast. So they built the first version using JavaScript on the back end and were able to deliver the story. Get all their tests in place and everything. The next time they came through, the next story they did, they're like, okay, now we're running into something that we really need Java for it. So they went ahead and rewrote the 5-10 lines or whatever that they had on the back end to take that step forward. But what it bought them is they were able to go ahead and deliver that faster, get feedback from the user on a bunch of other things, and get all these other things set up in the UI. And turned out to be a very valuable way for them to take a step forward and get feedback. From a waterfall standpoint, if you never want to change anything, like we're going to build this just one way and never have to change anything and it's not going to evolve, this is horrible, right? Because we create something in JavaScript and then we tore it out and did it in Java. From an Agile standpoint of trying to take iterative steps and evolve, it works really well. And this was particularly interesting because there was a lot of headbutting on this particular group between the team that was really embracing Agile and trying to take steps forward, incremental steps forward, and the team that was taking more of a the group that was taking more of a waterfall approach to things. But they eventually got the Java working and headed down that path and continued to evolve it as they went. But I think it's important to make sure the idea here is that we're wanting to have continuous attention to technical excellence. What is technically excellent to get your first story out may evolve and look a lot different for your third story and your fifth story and your 100th story down the line. But if you're continually giving it attention, you're going to evolve in a way that gets what's right just for you. Whereas if you try to make all the decisions up front, you're likely to get in a situation where you've made some of the decisions that you made since you didn't have feedback from what you're actually trying to do might turn out to be wrong. And very likely some of them will turn out to be wrong. So the flip side, the negative of this, of teams' continuous attention to technical excellence and good design enhances agility. The negative way I've seen people doing that is trying to assume that you can make all the right decisions up front instead of continually looking for how to improve from a simple state. One team put months into planning, but as they built the application, they discovered that what the user was asking for was slightly different from the way that they had planned it. But instead of approaching it as a continuous process, because we want continuous attention, instead of it being a continuous process, they stuck with the faulty design for way too long and started causing risks to other parts of the project. So things were separate that needed to be together, and together that needed to be separate. But since it wasn't a continuous attention of continually trying to make things better, the decisions were made at the point where they knew the least about the application, which meant by the time they got into the application, many of them were set in stone to the point that they didn't feel like they could change them like they needed to. And yes, the thing I was talking, the positive example I was giving, they had actually built BDD tests around everything. So when they went to change out the back end to Java, it wasn't that big of a lift for them because they could prove it worked very, very rapidly. The tests they were able to bring from iteration to iteration. Number 10, simplicity. The art of maximizing the amount of work not done is essential. One of the reasons this is so important is because if we're wanting to evolve what we do, continually looking at making it better, the more complicated we make it before we're actually getting feedback, the harder it is to actually evolve. So for example, I was working with one team and they started with an extremely dead simple pipeline. It was very simple, like so simple it was embarrassing how simple it was. As they kept on trying to do stuff, they always just kind of took the next step of the next thing that would possibly work and added complexity where it was needed. In the end, they ended up with solutions that were just as complex as what was requested, as what was necessary, but no more, and just as simple as what was possible, but no simpler. And that worked very well for them. Like, 5 years into it, they're still getting benefit from this pipeline that they've built just in response to the next piece they needed as simple as possible. And they also had times where they went back and said, hey, this part's gotten more complicated. Now that we know what we need, we can take this out and refactor to something else. On the other hand, I've worked with teams that have invested heavily in very complex pipelines to start out, even before they had any software to run through it. And there were some really cool things from a technical standpoint, it was awesome. Very, very cool things happening. But what happened was since they started out with a lot of complexity, when they tried to adapt it to what they learned from trying to use it for the real application they were trying to do, they had to take something that was complex and then add these adaptations to it that made it even more complex. So in the end, it had a whole bunch of complexity that wasn't originally needed. Just in the plan of how they were guessing the application would work, along with a bunch of complexity necessary to make the original complexity work for what was actually needed to deploy. And it wasn't because there weren't very, very cool technical things happening. It was just that without that feedback of here's a simple thing, we tried using it, okay, now let's go ahead and grow it. They got into a place where the complexity was actually making it really, really hard to make changes to it because there were so many assumptions built into it before they actually started getting feedback. Okay, principle number 11. The best architectures, requirements, and designs emerge from self-organizing teams. The best architectures, requirements, and designs emerge from self-organizing teams. So, positive example of a team that was following this is they were going to be dealing with a very large number of files coming in that had to be processed. And we're very concerned. They're moving from mainframe to a Java environment. And this was, like I said, maybe 10, 15 years ago. And they weren't really sure that they could get the performance out of the Java systems that they were getting out of their mainframes. So one of the early things they tried to address early on was the risk that they couldn't meet the performance. In a lot of teams, what would happen is you'd have like an architect or someone sit down and say, okay, here's how you're going to do this. You got to do this, and then go build it. This particular team, what they did is they broke up. And I remember I was with a guy named Pete. Pete and I sat down and everybody broke up into groups of 2 and tried to brainstorm and come up with some ideas and then come back in a group and then talk about the different approaches we had and talk through the strengths and weaknesses of different things. It wasn't forced on the team from the outside of here's how you're going to do it or just being one person. The team self-organized around how do we go ahead and come up with ideas for this. They worked through it, came up with a bunch of different ideas, got together, presented their ideas to each other, and eventually kind of converged around, here's an idea of how we think we should try this. Here's the smallest thing we think we can do to start getting feedback on this. And they did it, got some measurements, refined their idea, and continued to evolve as they went and ended up with something that was very, very performant, even more than they thought they could do. It had great scaling built in and stuff like that. But it was it emerged from the team rather than just being told, here, hey team, here's how you're going to do this. Now, the negative side of this I've seen is when you, if you don't believe this principle, you can get into a situation where you're like, okay, the best architectures, requirements, and designs emerge from people telling the team how to do it, rather than it being something that's self-organized within the team. So in a couple situations I've seen, you have a few people working on design, architecture, and requirements for a really long time without actual input from the team. And then when the team starts to actually try to build the application based on those, it's often that even if 90% of the decisions were right, there's probably going to be some blind spots because it had fewer people looking at it and it's not happening in response to actually trying to develop it. So instead of self-organizing solutions, okay, so in this example, as they get into doing development, it often becomes very evident that there are blind spots in the design, but instead of self-organizing solutions, you end up preserving the hierarchy. Sometimes where you've got developers building stuff, not because they understand what it does, but because the person that made the decision told them to build it this way. So developers end up doing things that they know are really bad ideas because they don't have the agency to change the design that they were given, and there's not a structure for that feedback happening. Doesn't mean that you don't want to have any idea of a design when going into it, but you need your team to be bought in and self-organized at least enough that they feel comfortable changing things as they discover stuff like, hey, this isn't really working for us here. We need to revamp this to work in a different way. Okay, and principle number 12. At regular intervals, the team reflects on how to become more effective, then tunes and adjusts its behavior accordingly. So most teams try to follow this by doing some type of retrospective. There was a team I was working with, and I realized as the Agile coach that we had not done a retrospective for a good 6 months. I was like, I am failing. This is awful. I'm not doing what I need to do with this team. So I was thinking of that as we were having the stand-up. Then I noticed something, because right as soon as we finished the stand-up, one of the developers spoke up and she said, hey, I'm having this issue with Spring Batch, and I'm not sure this is going to really work the way we expect. Does anyone want to stick around after the stand-up and we'll troubleshoot this? And then the next day somebody said something along the lines of, hey, I'm having trouble interfacing with this other team over here. Does anyone have any ideas? Can we kind of swarm around coming up with a solution of how maybe we can make these interactions work better? And I realized that they were on very regular intervals, almost every single day, reflecting on how to become more effective and then tuning, adjusting their behavior accordingly, even though they weren't having these regular retrospectives. Now, eventually we did go ahead and, I did my duty and we had a regular retrospective, but it was amazing to see how much they had internalized this principle because they were doing this just on a regular basis, just in the way that they were doing their work. The flip side of this, so that's a positive of a team following this principle. The flip side of it, though, is I've seen teams that are very religious about doing their retros every single 2 weeks or whenever they're scheduled, and nothing is going to change. They're always going to do the retrospectives, but most people go into it with the idea that retros are pointless and nothing will ever change. This, whether they're meeting for a retrospective or not, is not following the thing of tuning and adjusting your behavior accordingly. So you can get the look and the artifacts of doing retrospectives, but if you're not actually changing things, and if people have the idea that nothing's going to change, you're not actually following the spirit of this principle, which is at regular intervals, the team reflects on how to become more effective and then tunes and adjusts their behavior accordingly. So that got us through examples of all 12 principles, positive examples and negative examples. I hope that's useful. Let me just mention a few things coming up. So next week, we've got Julie Starling is going to be talking to us about using data to ignite meaningful action. She spoke to us last year, although I think she got married, so her last name's different now. So that should be exciting. Then on the 14th, we're going to talk about secrets of successful Scrum Masters, followed by Agile at a Distance, effective remote and hybrid teams. with lots of embarrassing examples of things I've done on remote that I did not mean to do. So that will be entertaining. And then Phil Ledgerwood is going to be talking to us about retrospectives that work on the 28th, and they'll take us through February. So appreciate everybody coming. I will stick out for a few minutes, stick around for a few minutes in case anybody wants to chat or anything. Thank you so much for coming. Hope to see you next week. Oh, and one other thing, the invites you get, if you forward those to someone, they should be able to add it to their calendar if they want. I'll be sending the ones for Julie out later this evening. So thank you everybody for coming. Love to chat if you've got anything you want to talk about. Okay, question. How do you include the customer in a retail product? So you're talking about you're making something that you're selling. Is that what you're talking about, Patrick? Okay, as opposed to custom software. So I used to work at a hospital years ago in the IT department, was a network administrator, and we were putting in a time card system. And I was curious about what you're describing there is how did they go ahead and actually figure out everything worked? What they had done is they had found a hospital that would be like their model hospital that they were going to try to implement it in first. So they had people that were going to start using it as they worked through the bugs. That's probably one of the best ways to do it is find somebody that's actually using the software. And oftentimes you kind of have dog fooding, like where you're using your own software for something. That can be a great way to do it. But finding somebody that's actually going to use it and get them on newer versions of the software so you can get feedback. What you don't want to do is deploy it to 10,000 people and then discover all the things that you have discovered had you talked to a customer early on. Yes, I do record these sessions. Matter of fact, I'll stop recording here.